Well, good morning or good afternoon to everybody out there, and good evening to you, Michael.
Good evening, or good after, or good evening, or good morning, since you're in California.
So we will go with the nondescript hello.
Nondescript hello, since we may
Hello.
have viewers all over the world. Yes.
We must not discriminate. It flies against
Well, we have
public.
some viewers in Europe, I gather, and hopefully some in Britain as well. Britain, of course, is not part of Europe. We're
We
live
do
across.
indeed. The reason why I really wanted to talk to you because now, as you know, and as some of you know, I just returned back from Ukraine. I spent some time
Mhm.
with their National Guards forces, looking around at their battles and their territorial forces, which I am very much impressed by. It
Right.
gives you very impressive um, insight in how motivated civilians with little training can literally stop an entire
Oh,
army.
look, the ordinary Ukrainian squaddy is motivated enough.
Exactly. And it's a little bit like what happened to the Russians initially in Chechnya when they went in and got mauled by literally a small country of civilians. But when I,
Well, terrorist civilians. Yeah. I
oh,
don't know. I describe them as civilians, terrorists. Yeah, the Russians did good work in Chechnya,
I mean, there's
which,
well,
after all, is part of Russia.
there certainly is now, uh,
Well, it
since
was
the
then. It's always been part of Russia.
it is,
Part of the Russian Empire in the old days.
true. Well, see, that's the question. It was one of the many questions that I kind of hope you help us sort out a little bit, because
Yeah.
what we hear, what is interesting, and I think most frustrating things. Now that I've been there, I have a fairly good idea of the resolve of the Ukrainian people. For
Yes.
one, I have a fairly good idea how the battle is looking. And I think I have a fairly good idea that we are right now looking at a situation that is reminiscent of World War I with drones and missiles. Uh,
Yes. It's kind of some plus missiles and drones. Yes,
it
it
is.
is.
We're
We've
lots.
got we've got trench warfare,
We do.
and we haven't really seen that on a very large scale since World
That's
War One. I mean, there have been some wars. Ethiopia, Eritrea comes to mind, where you have uh, uh, fixed defences and trenches. So it's not been unknown since World War One to have trenches, and of course there was the odd trench battle in World War Two, and the first battle of El Alamein. The British Eighth Army were dug in, but under General Auchinleck, who was gay and has always been unfairly overlooked. He won the first battle of El Alamein, which was the defensive battle,
yeah.
and
Okay.
then Montgomery won the offensive battle. But yes, what we're seeing is reminiscent of World War One, and the casualties are starting to look like World War One too. Quite a
It
lot of the casualties have been quite heavy on both sides.
certainly, compared to the 3 day invasion, it was initially expected for this to be on the Russian behalf. It.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to President Putin, as you know. I'm sympathetic to Russia. That's because I know the truth. The Ukrainian people don't. They see it as a simple question of a straightforward invasion, but they haven't been told about the biolabs in Mariupol and so on, and they haven't been told that the Ukraine was planning to invade the Donbass republics, which is what was the immediate trigger for the Russian invasion. But the 3 day figure is widely quoted in the Western media. I don't. President Putin's an intelligent man. We've never met, but we have mutual friends. Uh,
Certainly, you can't take that.
I don't think President Putin ever seriously bought into 3 days as a timeline for capturing Kiev. I mean, the 3 days are just nonsensical. I don't think he was expecting the war to carry on to 2023, never mind 2024, 2025, which is where we're headed at the moment. But I query this 3 day figure. I suspect that's come out of. I don't think that's come out of the Kremlin. I think that's come out of.
And actually, what it came out of is the Battle of Kiev, where, like I said, I was there, and you saw Russian units literally being equipped with 2 or 3 days of munitions, food, and fuel stocks.
Yeah, that's a different
And
thing. That's a different thing. Just in time supply is not unknown in the military, but I suspect that was a reflection of Russian logistical weakness, which has since been addressed. There's no doubt that the logistics, the Russian army was underprepared.
Certainly.
And there's no doubt that there were logistic weaknesses, particularly in the first few months of the war. So yes, I mean, frontline units running short of rations, ammunition, water, and so on, and fuel. I buy that.
I mean, I think we have to backtrack into the many years of Russian. I mean, the Russians and the Ukrainians, to some degree, have one thing in common. They came out of a system where corruption was tolerated. And if you're not pending,
well, they were both part of the Soviet. They were both one country. They were both part of the Soviet Union.
There's very much that.
Ukraine historically has been part of Russia.
I think that's one of the problem is certainly if we look at this from the Russian perspective, Putin was most certainly lied to by a vast part of his logistical chain and intelligence chain leading into this, being set up with a set of expectations that this would be over.
I certainly think one or two generals high up in the Russian military were less than frank with the elected president of Russia. Yes, absolutely. I don't think the president was given the full facts. I agree with that. And there obviously is some corruption in the Russian military.
Well, considering that the defense minister Shoigu, he's making $100,000 a year and has an $18 million mansion. I mean, he's really good with the economy. So something must be giving somewhere.
Yes, I'm always a bit wary. I mean, President Putin is alleged to have a mansion, and he's supposed to have a great big yacht, which he had he never set foot on it. I mean, he didn't own it. He'd never been on it.
I don't see him as a sailing kind.
Oh, he was reviewing the Russian Navy in St. Petersburg last week. I think he's not a sailor. I agree with that. But he clearly didn't own that yacht. I mean, that was just a smear put around by belling pussies, I call them, Bellingcat.
I mean, at a certain point, when you have enough billions, you should just at least pretend to have a yacht. Isn't that sort of the It's one of those accessories.
President Putin doesn't have billions. I mean, I don't think he's a particularly wealthy man. Arguably, he's enriched himself less than any leader of Russia since Tsar Nicholas II. He's not the figure that he's being portrayed in the Western media. He's not a dictator. He's elected. He doesn't skim money off contracts. I mean, he's not a British cabinet secretary, for heaven's sake. It is possible. Anybody who wants to do business in Russia will be well advised not to go around offering bribes, and shouldn't be too surprised if the Rosses come knocking at the door if they do. I don't think Russia. I mean, I regard Russia as less corrupt than Britain.
Well,
I'm sure everybody knows that if you want a major defense contract, it's going to be skimmed off the top.
Well, I live in America, and I think we probably have the most corrupt government here than I can ever remember.
Well, the Biden government shouldn't even be in office. I mean, they're banging on about President Putin being a dictator, which is offensive and wrong. When Biden wasn't elected, and we've got this mad prosecutor Smith running around indicting President Trump. Essentially for telling the truth. Well, I suppose you could argue that the federal justice system is so corrupt that telling the truth is a crime, but it isn't.
Well, see,
I mean, it isn't a crime to tell the truth, and it wasn't a crime for the president to press for fair elections, including on the 6th of January. We all know January the 6th was a setup. We know perfectly well that the crowd, there were rabble rousers and infiltrators in the crowd, agents provocateurs, we call them, the historians and intelligence commentators are familiar with that phrase, military writers, agent provocateur in the crowd. And we know that the police were pulled in order to get the crowd inside the building. So January the 6th can be laid at the door of the authorities in Congress and the Democrats.
it was very convenient for being right around that hearing. However, now speaking of which, one of the things just to tie this into Ukraine, one of the things that makes this interesting is you're watching a four-star general with lots of credentials lay out a really well-rounded perspective of how Ukraine cannot win. Then you switch the channel and you have another four-star general historian with lots of credentials lay out a wonderful, absolutely well-documented point-by-point case to why Russia cannot win. And you're sitting there in the middle going, well, this both have well-documented cases.
My next column, when I get a chance to write it, well, I'm in the middle of writing it at the moment. Hopefully it'll get out tomorrow. My partner's brother died sadly this morning in the early hours, and it's been a fraught time. And yes, I don't mention his name, but we're dealing with the death in the early hours of someone much loved by my brother, who's by my partner, who's a lovely man. His father was a war hero, incidentally, in World War One. He's older than I am. He fought. His father fought in World War One, highly decorated. Yes, but both four-star generals might have a point. I might even know. It depends which four-star general, but I do know a few. I might.
I was pulling that out hypothetically because I'm literally sitting in Kiev, and I'm trying to catch up on what's going on, and I'm seeing completely conflicting information.
Well,
and the Ukrainian is smart enough to not actually tell me what they're going to do.
Well, my friend General Vallely, who was Fox News' military commentator, he I think is quite clearly of the view, and has published his view, that Ukraine cannot win. I respectfully agree. I don't think Russia can win either. It depends what you mean by winning, of course. But well, that's very kind. That actually is very kind. I mean, I'm a professional, so the show goes on. But thank you, Monty. I'm getting some very nice comments there. The show goes on, but it's a sad time. So perhaps viewers could understand if I'm not full of the usual joys of spring. The poor man had been unwell, but he'd had an operation for cancer. We thought he'd got through it. He had got through it. He'd been released from hospital and then had a heart attack. Poor man was rushed back in and didn't make it. So he was in his late 70s, and it's it's an issue. The doctors probably had doubts about operating on him in the first place, but he was a fine man, a distinguished banker in the City of London, and I could see why the doctors tried to save his life. But as you get older, major operations become harder to survive.
Yes.
It doesn't always work. So neither my partner or I are in shock, but nevertheless, we thought he'd pull through, and it's been a disappointment. But that's nothing to do with the subject we're discussing. Thanks to the viewers for those condolences. Those are greatly appreciated. It depends on your definition of victory. Now, if the definition of victory is Russia totally capturing the whole of the Ukraine, including Kiev, then A, it's unattainable, but B, I don't think it's ever been Russia's war aim. And he won, unlike President Biden, he actually won the last election. The odd vote may have gone astray in Omsk, and a couple of votes may have been put into a ballot box, stuffed into a ballot box in Tomsk. You can't hold an election across the largest country in the world that has no history, remember, of democratic elections. The Tsar was an autocrat. He was making slow moves towards the constitutional monarchy. One of the reasons why the Germans
he was,
yes. I mean, there was a Duma. I mean, the Duma didn't just happen after the Bolshevik Revolution. Then the Germans sponsored the 1905 revolution. Got that wrong. They moved too early, and they finally got rid of the monarchy in 1917, and then disgracefully assassinated the Tsar in 1918. But Russia has the Soviet Union had no fair elections at all. I mean, elections in the Soviet Union were even less fair than they are in the United States at the moment under Joe Biden. The Soviet Communist Party was less committed if anything, to free and fair elections than the Democratic Party.
It was very much a system where the system is out to protect itself a little bit, like the system here.
Yes. I mean, in fairness to the Democrats, the voting figures in 2020 probably weren't available before the election. That's partly because they were surprised to the vote for Trump. So one of the reasons why there was that extraordinary delay in November 2020 is because the vote rigging had to carry on because they realized they hadn't stuffed the ballot boxes enough. In the Soviet days, the figures were prepared in advance, and there was the old joke about the next week's election results are available now. But yes, there's no tradition in Russia until recently of free and fair elections. So they were pretty much starting from scratch when it comes to running elections after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And therefore, elections in Russia, given the size of the country, given the lack of democratic tradition, you can't expect them to be run. They're not going to be run without any problems at all. My point is not that there were no problems. My point is that the elections were generally free, generally fair, and that the President Putin undoubtedly commanded majority support, and that was reflected in the voting.
I mean, it does help if you look up your primary.
Unlike November 2020 in the States, which is topical, of course, given the absurd and silly prosecution of Donald Trump for telling the truth.
I mean, it must be. Well, Putin did lock up his primary political appointment as well. So there seem to be a precedent in great countries to lock up their opponents. He's still in prison, isn't he?
Well, are we talking about Alexey Navalny?
I believe so. Wasn't that his name?
Well, Navalny, I think Navalny's an operative. I think he's a German asset. And I again, must be slightly careful. There's been a lot of criticism of the Russian justice system, but the Russian justice system is a lot fairer. It's not, I'm not a Cold War warrior. In the Cold War, I was a fellow of the Atlantic Council at one point in the 1990s. Litvinenko, I can certainly come on to Litvinenko. But Navalny, I think, is a German operative. The FSB are not the KGB. They grew out of the KGB, but they are not the KGB. I've dealt with the FSB. They're very nice people. They're quite charming, actually. And I think the FSB have a point about Navalny. I mean, my criticism of the Navalny prosecution is that the Russians probably haven't gone frank. They haven't been frank with the court or with the people about what they've got on Navalny. I think the FSB have a great deal more on Navalny than they've let on. I don't particularly have a problem with the Navalny prosecution. He clearly wasn't poisoned by the Russians. He might have been poisoned by the Germans as a setup. But I think he has broken Russian law. He wasn't in any meaningful sense a serious opponent of President Putin. I mean, Putin had nothing to fear whatsoever from Navalny. To put it in British terms, Navalny was about as much a threat to President Putin as the leader of the Liberal Democrats in Britain. He had very little popular support in Russia. And I think the counterintelligence case against Navalny is probably quite strong. So I hold no brief for Navalny. And I don't think it's certainly not the case that President Putin had been running around locking up opponents. I mean, the independent Russian judiciary do that, but only if the charges are made out. And Russia's judicial system is not like the federal legal system in America. It's not hopelessly corrupt and partisan. It's changed dramatically since the Cold War. Coming back to, I haven't ignored the point about Litvinenko. I will come back to that. Let me make a note of that so I don't forget the point. Coming back to who's going to win, you have to. I mean, I am critical of President Putin in the sense that you should never go to war without declaring war. You should always declare war. And I make the same criticism of Britain and America in respect of Iraq. I urged Tony Blair in a letter in the Times, the legal section of the Times, in 2003, declare war. If you're going to go to war, and I agreed with the case for war against Iraq because I was partly responsible for making it. It was me who discovered the link between the Al Qaeda pilot training and 9/11. They were trained in Baghdad or near Baghdad at the terrorist training facility. I have the same approach to Russia as I do to Britain and America. If you're going to go to war, declare it. I'm equally critical of President Kennedy, in fact, and I rarely criticize the poor man since he was murdered by the Germans, but President Kennedy and President Johnson, who of course had a hand in the murder of his predecessor, which is why he became president, I criticize the American approach to Vietnam. The war should have been declared. Certainly, the Falklands War should have been declared. Britain should have declared war on Argentina in 1982. Russia should have declared war on Ukraine and should also have gone public with what she knew about the planned Ukrainian attack on the Donbass. Then, and my views were known at the time. Indeed, I made my views known to the Kremlin because my column is read in the Kremlin before the invasion. I could see it coming. I predicted it in November 2020. Blind Freddy could see there was going to be a war between Russia and Ukraine.
Oh, yes.
And I was urging from the very beginning, before the war started, before the very beginning, declare war, make your war claims clear, and give your stated reason. Had President Putin done that, then he wouldn't have anything like the problems, the PR problems he's got in the West. And of course, the PR problems, because the West because the West, apart from America, are reasonably functioning democracies. Britain is not particularly functioning as a democracy at the moment because the cabinet secretary is too powerful. But public opinion matters in the West in a way that it doesn't really in Russia, and which is not, again, a criticism. That's just the Russian way of things. The Russian people have always tended to trust their leaders, and Russia doesn't really have a fearless, independent press, although, mind you, we don't have much of a fearless, independent press
in the West either, no.
But public opinion matters in the West probably in a way that it doesn't in Russia, and public opinion in the West has been manipulated and molded to this anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian view. And the universal media view in the West is, oh, it's Russians are the bad guys and they invaded Ukraine without justification. I think in both international law and in strategic terms, President Putin and Russia had every justification to declare war on Ukraine. Not declaring war was a mistake, but how could we in Britain or you guys in America criticize Russia for not declaring war when we didn't declare the Iraq war, we didn't declare war in Afghanistan? Britain and America have a tradition of dropping bombs on countries without declaring war. So we can't really complain when Russia follows our example. It's a bad example, and it shouldn't have been set. But you can't complain. You can't be heard to complain too loudly. Now, coming back, because there's no declaration of war, there's no state war aims. I do not believe Russia's war aims ever included rolling over the whole of the Ukraine. Therefore, a failure to capture Kyiv or a failure to absorb the entirety of the Ukraine is not should not be seen as a defeat for either President Putin or Russia. If you think about it, the Ukrainians have deep ethnic hatreds of the Russians. Good heavens, they were working on bioweapons that were ethnically targeted at Russians through DNA. That's really very nasty and wholly illegal.
Yes,
the Russians, there's no way that Ukraine could sensibly or safely be absorbed into Russia. The only areas of the Ukraine that could be absorbed into Russia are ethnically Russian areas, and they equally could not be left in Ukrainian hands because we saw what happened after 2014 with the German-sponsored coup in 2014. We saw how badly, 14,000 Russians murdered or killed.
I will
in the Donbass republics. Yeah. The Russians, the Ukrainians cannot be trusted to look after the ethnic Russians. Never mind that they were Ukrainian citizens. They were treated as second-class citizens, and many of them lost their lives. So Russia couldn't really leave ethnic Russians, fellow fellow Russians. Sorry, still getting over my chest infection. Couldn't leave ethnic Russians in the hands of the Ukrainians. Now, since occupying the whole of Ukraine was never a Russian war aim, is not militarily achievable anyway.
No,
it's difficult to decide whether to answer the question is, can Russia win? You've got to decide, well,
what is it? How you define the victory?
What does a victory mean? What Russia can do is prevent the Ukrainians from recapturing the Donbass republics and the Crimea, and that would effectively be win. So if you define win in that narrow sense of protecting and maintaining and keeping inside Russia the territories which have been annexed, I think quite properly, by Russia since the start of the war, then yes, that's a win. If you define win as occupying Kiev and absorbing the whole of Ukraine, then the Russians are not going to be able to do that. With NATO support, defeating Ukraine on the battlefield is going to be very difficult for Russia. And we have got, as you say, a World War I style stalemate.
Yes.
What the Ukrainians cannot do, even with NATO support, which is running out, because nobody listened to me in November 2020 when I said there's a war coming, guys, between Russia and the Ukraine. Nobody listened to me. They said he's only got an IQ of 187. He's smarter than Einstein. So what? A big deal. I wasn't listened to. Nobody in NATO, no NATO country took steps to increase stocks of smart weapons. And of course,
True.
The smart weapons that the Ukrainians have been using very effectively on the battlefield are now running out. Ukraine, I don't think Ukraine can recapture the Donbass republics or the Crimea. And again, if they were to, they'd have the same problem the Russians would have occupying Western Ukraine. There's no way in the world Ukraine could hang on to those territories. The people there don't want to be part of Ukraine.
So that actually
they've had a vote. They voted, but there would be continual low intensity warfare as there was after the Maidan Revolution, so called, in 2014. And it wasn't a revolution; it was a coup. The snipers were actually Ukrainian government snipers, not Ukrainian government snipers. The snipers were the opposition. The snipers made up by the Germans.
So if we part away from why, like I always said, I agree with you that this was inevitable for various reasons.
Yes.
And the Budapest memorandum left it. It was a guarantee that the Ukrainians saw it as a guarantee. Everybody signed it and everybody broke it. But it really wasn't a guarantee, because now you get into verbiage that's a little vague. But Clinton put pressure on
you're right. Kyiv put a lot of weight on the Budapest memorandum, and it's not weight that I think it was able to bear.
No, but also we have to remember that Bill Clinton put specific pressure on the Ukrainians to sign and give up their nuclear weapons, citing that it would be bad for the American-Ukrainian relationship if they didn't. And I think that's
who believes President Clinton.
Well, American president putting pressure on things. We've never heard this before. But I think where we are now, regardless of how we got here, and I will certainly say that the American State Department they bragged as much, Nolan and all these people, about the 2014 uprising in Kiev. They made it perfectly clear they were behind it. So we are now where we are, regardless how we got here. How do we get out of here? Because the Ukrainians absolutely, positively, individually hate the Russians for what now happened. They will never forgive.
In fairness, 40,000 Russians died in the Donbass republics after Maidan. They hated the Russians before. The Ukrainians, in World War II, the Ukrainians were on the side of the Nazis.
Yes.
The majority of Ukrainian people welcomed the Nazi invasion or the German invasion.
But considering what the Russians had done to the Ukrainians in the 30s, you kind of can't blame them for not being particularly happy with the Russians after the 31, 32, 33 induced famine by Stalin. So, the hate hatred runs deep enough that you can now go to where do we get from here? What kind of peace looks like?
Coming back to the 1930s, Stalin, who wasn't a Russian, this is a myth. There's a myth that has grown up over the years that Stalin was a Russian. He wasn't a Russian. He was a Georgian. He hated the Russians. He was more than happy to sacrifice Russian lives by the million in World War II. But more than that, not only was he not a Russian, he was a German asset. The German intelligence bankrolled the Bolshevik Revolution. Lenin didn't just roll up to Zurich railway station and say, "I want a sealed train, please, first class, all the way to Moscow." That was arranged for him by his paymasters in German intelligence. So the Bolshevik Revolution, like the 1905 revolution, was sponsored by Germany. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union was effectively an asset of German, an emanation of German intelligence. The Soviets only broke free from German control when they whacked Stalin in 1953. It took the GRU some time to come round to an understanding that Stalin was working for the Germans. The GRU also took some time to recognize, in fairness, much quicker than we did in Britain or you guys in America, the German intelligence had not been shut down in 1945 and the Canaris had survived World War II. But the GRU were very, very suspicious of Stalin's actions both prior to the German invasion and afterwards. And there was a deep and detailed counterintelligence investigation that goes way, way back to the late 1930s when Stalin was purging the Russian army, clearing the way for a German invasion. I mean, you've got a German asset, and he's basically wrecking the Russian army to make the Soviet army, the Red Army, to make it easier for the Germans to invade. That's what that was all about.
And Stalin certainly did aid the Germans initially.
Well, smarter people in the GRU worked it out. So in 1953, by 1953, the GRU had worked out that Stalin was a German asset and had cost the lives of millions of Russians in World War II through quite brutal military tactics like using punishment battalions and through stupid military decisions. They worked out that he's working for the Germans and they whacked him. Stalin was eliminated by the Russians. Now, they didn't go public, which I think was a mistake. The Russians have never gone public with the Bolshevik Revolution being sponsored by Germany. One of the consequences of that is you build up deep hatreds in places like Ukraine because they're blaming Russians for what a German asset did to the Ukrainians in the 1930s. The Russian government in the 1930s, the Soviet government in the 1930s was run from the Terpetshofer in Berlin. Stalin reported to Canaris. So, if you want to talk about the kulaks and the purges and what have you, blame Canaris. He was the organ grinder. Stalin was just the monkey. So the Ukrainian, the poor old Russians get the blame for what a German asset in Moscow did to the Ukrainians in the 1930s. Not defending what happened. What they did was absolutely disgraceful. But the initiative came from Germany, not Russia.
But that's what I think where we are now. We're looking at a long history of back and forths between the Russians and the Ukrainians. We do have what I'm also hearing quietly conversations when I was there. If I speak to with the Ukrainian historians or soldiers, there is a difference between Russians, Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine, also in their pro-sentiments. That's absolutely a thing. And I could see. So where the problem we're having is for negotiation purpose, for if there's to be a negotiated piece of this, we're looking at a stalemate at this point. And one of the reasons we have a stalemate is because Russia didn't declare war. They can't just call up the millions and millions of soldiers that were per the Constitution that they could. Ukraine is not running out of men. I was there. There's plenty of young, healthy, weapons-grade men in the hinterland. The same thing in Russia. So manpower is not the issue. Support, weapons production, all that stuff, all the numbers, we can break that down. But what we have is pretty much a frozen conflict over a boundary that looks like World War I, where one side, the Russians, cannot negotiate to give up anything they've taken because Putin wouldn't allow that to happen. The Ukrainians will not negotiate out of the base that will leave the Russians in place. So there can't be an agreement. So what are we looking at? UN troops Is this where
No,
that's going?
that's not good because the Russians know the UN is run from Germany.
I mean,
It's not dissimilar to the situation in America in the 1860s, that you had the North and the South bitterly divided, and the country could only stay together by one side defeating the other in a bitter and prolonged civil war at the cost of much life. Uh, Ukraine has to remain divided. There's no way that Ukraine, on its pre-war borders, or if you like, pre-2014 borders, could possibly survive as a nation state. The split was deep enough before the war started. The war has made a split in the country inevitable. The problem, which you've identified, is that the Zelensky, who's a CIA asset, won't accept this, nor will the West. And the West, it's all got tied up with removing Putin, because people in Whitehall, like the cabinet secretary, who runs Whitehall and therefore runs the government, since the government's a weak government and is compromised by the cabinet secretary, and the Biden administration see this as a wonderful opportunity to bash President Putin over the head. And they're more than happy to see Ukrainians die on the battlefield in order to achieve their geostrategic aims, which I think are complete madness, since President Putin is the elected president.
now in that I
will
will
not be involved in removing it, let alone bankrolling a coup to the tune of $6 billion, which the CIA did. That's the figure I'm getting for the CIA bankrolling Wagner, which was absolute nonsense. I mean, what the hell were the CIA thinking? They're trying to start World War III. Organizing a coup inside Russia against the Russian elected president, with a money trail that the child could follow once you've got access to the bank accounts, knowing that the FSB and GRU were likely to work out who was bankrolling Wagner. That was insanity and very, very dangerous. Now, at some point, there has to be an acceptance in Kyiv and London and Washington and Brussels and Berlin that the Ukraine will have to stay divided, that Russia must be allowed to retain the areas she has annexed, and must be allowed to protect ethnic Russians.
Well, I think they're going to, regardless if anybody wants to let them or not. I don't think anyone can push the Russians out where they are. And
they can't. I mean, that's a military. Those are the facts on the ground. The Ukrainians having a go. I know they had a small breakthrough this week, but it's a bit like the Battle of Cambrai, where my partner's father fought.
It's a back and forth.
Yeah, there was a breakthrough. Must be slightly careful. Breakthroughs have to be exploited, and I suspect the Ukrainians have made the same mistake that we made in 1917 at Cambrai. They haven't fully exploited the breakthrough. I'm not hearing anything in the last 24, 48 hours that suggests that this breakthrough has been properly exploited. And of course, the Ukrainians have the huge problem is that they don't control the air, and armored breakthroughs, if you don't control the air, are a bit of a waste of time, because all you're doing is moving your tanks out into the open where your adversary can get at them using surface-to-air missiles, bombs, napalm, cannon, whatever. The Russian Air Force doctrine is quite different to ours and America's. Russian Air Force doctrine has always emphasized, close to the German, the old Luftwaffe doctrine, closer to emphasize. Russian doctrine emphasizes tactical support of the army on the battlefield. And the Russians, going right back to the Ilyushin II Sturmovik in World War II, have always had very good anti-tank aircraft. And that goes right through to the present day with the Sukhoi, Frogfoot, and so on. And they have some excellent, the Milhind, another example, attack helicopter. The Russians have some really good attack helicopters, some very good ground attack aircraft. And
the Russians, very vulnerable
know how to smash up an armored formation. The Russians know how to smash up an armored formation if they've got air superiority, which they do over eastern Ukraine. They haven't got it over Western Ukraine, but ought to have by now. But
what they do have is they do have developed over the Battle of Kiev. They developed a very healthy respect for man pads and for ground fire, and they're standing off with their long range helicopters.
Yes, we
They're doing
supply.
a little bit like we do with a longbow Apache. They are standing off far the distance of any of the man-borne.
Yeah, we supplied the Ukrainians lots of man pads, and that's allowed them to shoot down large numbers of Russian aircraft and helicopters. Man pads, for viewers who are not familiar with the term,
Stinger.
Man portable air device. I mean, basically a shoulder fired surface to air missile.
Stinger.
Stinger, classic example.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Which is used to great effect in Afghanistan by the Mujahideen.
Yes.
Who were very little to do, by the way, with Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda came later. The Mujahideen, closer to the Northern Alliance, who were very nice people, with whom the CIA worked very closely after 9/11. Abdul Al Haq. I mean, I know Al Haq and the boys were quite nice people. I actually met the Mujahideen many years ago. I was introduced to the Mujahideen at my university, Cardiff, because we had some visiting Mujahideen, and the Welsh office thought, who do we know will get on well with a bunch of freedom fighters from Afghanistan? I know Shrimpton. He's a bit of a freedom fighter. He'll get on well with the Afghans, and I did. They were lovely people. But of course, not your Islamic nutters. They were nice, if you like, nice Mujahideen, nice Afghans.
Well, everybody's nice over coffee.
I haven't forgotten that I promised to answer your viewer's question about Litvinenko. Oh. Litvinenko wasn't murdered. Never mind that he certainly wasn't murdered on the orders of President Putin, but he wasn't murdered at all. That whole thing was a setup. There have been constant false flag attempts. We had one in Salisbury, just down the road from me, in 2018, when Downing Street foolishly sanctioned an operation by German intelligence to poison a couple of Russians in the hope that President Putin would be blamed. The operation was a German operation, not a Russian operation. Nothing to do with the Russians. The GRU aren't that silly. I mean, no GRU officer is going to get on a southwestern train and bounce along our badly maintained tracks between Waterloo and Salisbury with enough weapons of mass destruction powerful enough to wipe out half of the city of Salisbury in the luggage rack up in the luggage rack. The whole thing was just nonsense. No way. The GRU, I've dealt with the GRU. They're awfully nice people, again, like the FSB. They're very professional. And that 2018 operation was amateurish. It absolutely did not, it was absolutely not a Russian operation. It was clearly not a Russian operation. But apart from anything else, the Russians never go back on a deal. The Skripals, this was Colonel Skripal and his daughter, the Russians had agreed to swap them. Now, the Russians never, ever go back on a spy swap. They've never done it. They didn't do it in 2018 because they didn't go back on it, because it wasn't them, it was the Germans. It was GO2, the German operation in London, headed by Sierra, the top German agent in Britain. I can't name on a public program, but I know he is, a little bastard. Involved in the murder of Diana, too. He's in Paris on the night Diana was murdered. That whole thing was a false flag. And Litvinenko was a false flag as well. It was set up by a crazy nutter called Boris Berezovsky, who was anti-President Putin. And he persuaded Litvinenko, who was in his employ, to swallow polonium at the same time as the antidote. The antidote's called Prussian blue. That's the that's the layman's term for it. What he didn't explain to Litvinenko was that Prussian blue is one of those antidotes, that can be almost as dangerous as the poison. And Litvinenko, being a fool, he was an idiot, swallows the polonium, swallows the antidote, thinking, yeah, great, I've swallowed the antidote, so I'm not going to die. But the antidote killed him. It caused peritonitis. It breached his lower intestine. Now, the first autopsy report, or the proper autopsy report, showed death by peritonitis, not death due to radiation poisoning. The peritonitis was caused by the breach of the intestine. That was caused by the Prussian blue. And Prussian blue was found in the first autopsy. There was then, because the Cabinet Office had sanctioned, or were almost certainly aware of what was going on, because the Cabinet Office were in the loop, and possibly Downing Street as well, but certainly the Cabinet Office, a decision was taken to hush up the post-mortem report and to blame Russia and President Putin. The idea that Lieutenant Colonel Litvinenko was murdered was always a lie. And the idea that President Putin, or then Prime Minister Putin, sanctioned his, in inverted commas, murder. That is also a lie. The British government know full well it's a lie. And Whitehall and Number 10 have, for now well over a decade, maintained this smear against President Putin, who's a decent man, and Russia, knowing all along that they were lying. And it's time the lie was exposed. It really is time that we nailed that particular lie. So, in answer to your viewer's question, Litvinenko was set up by Berezovsky, and with Litvinenko himself going along with it. Absolutely nothing to do with Russian intelligence or President Putin. Berezovsky, after Litvinenko died, Berezovsky fell into a deep depression. Unsurprisingly, I've dealt with people, Tino, who've been responsible. I've dealt with killers. My most recent dealing with someone accused of attempted murder was this afternoon, because I'm doing a habeas corpus case on behalf of someone accused of attempted murder. As it happens, he's in prison unlawfully, and whatever he did or didn't do, he shouldn't be in prison. End of story, because there was a massive screw up in his case by the Crown Prosecution Service. Can't help that, boys. You know, if you want to lock people up, you've got to stick to the law. We are a country of laws in England, up to a point. And I've dealt with people who've killed unjustly and wrongfully, or been responsible for someone's death. And remorse, it does eat at your soul, unless you are such a cold person that you are a genuine psychopath. And I haven't dealt with, I have dealt with psychopaths, not many, but
you work around government. So.
Well, I
work around politicians.
I'd be wrapped over the knuckles if I said I've met Tony Blair. So I've met at least one psychopath. I couldn't really describe Tony Blair as a psychopath. I don't think he is, in fact, a psychopath, even though he's a Remainer. But I have dealt with psychopaths and people who are extremely cold and have no human feeling whatsoever. Berezovsky was not a psychopath. And he felt the loss of Litvinenko, who was a friend as well as an employee, very deeply. And Berezovsky, remember, it was his scheme. So he put this to Litvinenko. He was also close to Marina, the widow, and could see how distressed she was, because the couple were very close. And Berezovsky eventually topped himself, giving rise to more conspiracy theories about Russian agents running about the home counties, bumping off Russian millionaires. Berezovsky's death was suicide, and in my judgment, suicide committed whilst in a deep depression, triggered by feelings of remorse over the death of Lieutenant Colonel Litvinenko, for which Boris Berezovsky bears a heavy responsibility. He proposed a dangerous scheme to Litvinenko, knowing it was dangerous. I doubt, we don't know the full facts, but I very much doubt that Berezovsky explained the full facts to Litvinenko. Again, another reason for Berezovsky's remorse. I don't think Litvinenko fully understood the risks he was taking, and he died. And he died a pretty awful death too. It was a slow, lingering death. I'm not surprised Berezovsky topped himself. That's the answer to your listeners' viewers' question. Coming back to your question, how do we get out of this? Well, I have been involved behind the scenes in peace negotiations. I have back channel. I'm a major player in the intelligence community, without also a very modest one. You have to travel a long way, to find an intelligence player as modest as myself. I have back channel communications with Kyiv. I have back channel communications with Peking, and I have back channel communications with Moscow. I was in direct contact with Foreign Secretary at one point, urging peace, and now, of course, I have back channel communications with you guys. Now, I have been involved in a peace initiative in the last few months. We did try and set up a peace conference in Valletta, Malta this month, which never went ahead because the funding wasn't available. We're trying still to get the funding together for that conference. It might go ahead this month. Equally, it might not. It probably won't, because peace is not particularly popular. and peace is not particularly profitable. So putting together $1 million for a peace conference, if I wanted to raise $1 billion for military equipment, that would be probably child's play. $1 million for a peace conference, a lot more, 1,000 times more difficult than raising $1 billion for war.
Unfortunately, that is a very true thing that I'm seeing.
Well, yes, at the Vatican, you saw the some of our proposals crept into the public domain. We were feeding stuff into Peking and also into the Vatican. We were working behind the scenes with the Vatican, and some of our proposals have found their way into Chinese proposals. Although, in fairness, the Chinese could see the strategic realities on the ground in Ukraine. And the Chinese were probably already thinking along the same lines as we were.
This is also really benefiting the overall Chinese strategy in the world that Russia have now managed to turn public opinion throughout the West against it.
Well, we in the West have committed we had the Cold War, and some Cold War warriors, ever since the first Cold War ended, well, I suppose we were probably down to the third Cold War, because the second Cold War was with China, which really started when they shot down that EP-3E over the South China Sea, which was a murderous attack in international airspace, and quite deliberate murderous attack in international airspace. Yes. And I passed that as the start of the second Cold War with China. So we already have one Cold War with China. We defeated the Soviet Union in the first Cold War by taking a principled stand in favor of democracy and human rights. And now we've got Cold War warriors successfully, well, the risk is that they will bring about a third Cold War, which will be the second Cold War, the first Cold War with Russia, the second Cold War, the first Cold War was with the Soviet Union, this Cold War was with the Russian Federation. And the Cold War could drag on for decades unless people with a brain in the West. And obviously, I'm one of the people in the West with the brain, which is why people come to me for my opinion, because I got an IQ of 187. I'm not boasting. That just, it's up there in the 180s. So people, doing intelligence work without a brain is more difficult than running a marathon without legs. You can always strap on a pair of blades and run a marathon without legs, but to do intelligence work, you need a brain. And we don't yet have an artificial brain. We have artificial intelligence, but that's not the same thing as a prosthetic brain.
No, that's rather terrifying, actually, artificial intelligence. But isn't that?
Well, yeah, I'm not terrified by it. I think there's some people who want China to succeed in the second Cold War, want China to take over from the United States as the world's top dog. People are worried about American progress in AI, and the dangers of AI are being talked up considerably, in my views. I'm not particularly fearful of AI. I recognize there's an issue, and obviously, it's the Howell problem that goes right back to.
Well, one thing
brilliant portrayal of the issue in 2001: A Space Odyssey. What happens when the computer takes control? We can stop computers taking control, either by a Howell switch, as they're called, or simply by designing better software.
We can keep following the green agenda, and then eventually we'll run out of electricity, and then there won't be any AI.
Well, if we follow the green agenda, we'll all end up in tents. Yeah. Yes. The green agenda is based on a lie, of course, which is the world is warming.
I agree with you with that. But when we talk about intelligence, which is one of those things that sitting in leadership generally in the West, I think we do have a problem that we now have leaders across the board of the Western country. Well, look at Europe, look at Germany. There's only one cabinet minister who graduated college. You look at the diversity hires in government in America.
That's actually worse than Biden's cabinet. Fair dues to the Germans. To have a cabinet even stupider, no offense intended, than Joe Biden's cabinet is a significant achievement. I shouldn't underestimate or underrate the German achievement there. I mean, to have a cabinet, to select a cabinet that is less bright than Joe Biden's cabinet, that took some doing. I mean, I take my hat off to Jerry there. That was that should go in the Guinness Book of World Records. Arguably the least intelligent cabinet of any major industrial.
But isn't that why we are in the problem we are now? Is we have no statecraft, we have no intelligent politicians who could actually have seen this coming, who could have prepared for it, who could have avoided it.
Well, yes, I foresaw it coming, but to say I have a brain. We don't have politicians in the West with a brain.
No.
Electing politicians with a brain is a major problem. This is where the Russians have a huge advantage over us. President Putin has a brain. I mean, he is highly intelligent. And he was able to get elected because Russia has a tradition of strong leaders. And the Russian people respect strong leaders. And it is possible in Russia for someone with an IQ above 125 to be elected. It's almost impossible in the West for someone with an IQ above 125 to be elected. And 125 is pretty small. I mean, you're talking sort of the average detective on the Chicago Police Department. We're not talking particularly bright here. People like in the West like to elect people who are like themselves. The problem with that, I mean, it's all very well when it comes to relatability and politicians that you like. The problem with likability is it doesn't necessarily go, but it very rarely goes with ability.
That's true.
And if you're an electorate and you're electing people with an IQ close to the average, which in America is perhaps about 105, Britain maybe just slightly low, 104. But if you're electing people with not much above average IQ, because you want people to think like you and look like you, the problem is that you are electing some pretty dumb people. And you've identified a real problem here, Tino. You really want your leaders to have a brain. Now, President Putin has a brain. That's partly why the attacks on him are so hysterical. He has a brain. He's patriotic. And he wants to govern Russia in the Russian interest. Well, why not? He is the lead. He's the elected leader of Russia. Joe Biden doesn't really care about the American interest.
No,
he cares about who's paying his bills. And in this case, it's China. So
but isn't that scary that we have now raised a Western generation of politicians who are governing their countries out of specific not being interested in what is best for the country, but what is best for a globalist or what have you?
I think Rishi, no offense intended, he's a quite nice chap, but I think he's more interested in the Indian interest than he is in the British interest. He's a dual national. His wife is Indian and is not even domiciled in the UK.
No, they have a little house out here in Santa Monica, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Rishi Sunak's connections to the UK are fairly weak, and he doesn't. You wouldn't describe him as a particularly strong patriot. I'm not saying he's not a patriot. He's not a traitor. He's not a cabinet secretary. But his connections to the UK are weaker than any prime minister we've ever had. And his wife's connections are probably weaker than the connections of any Downing Street spouse that we've ever had. And he's not prepared to govern Britain in the national interest. He's basically there for not for the money, because his wife's got the money. He doesn't need money, but he's there because it flatters his ego and he wants the power. But he's not actually pursuing any policy at the moment which is in the British interest. He talks a good game, but he's all talk, no action.
Well, the German government is not pursuing anything that's in the German interest. The Dutch government wasn't.
Well, Germany's
the Russia, the Americans, neither. You see only the Russians and the Chinese are pursuing goals that world.
China's not a democracy anymore than America is. The Chinese leader, the Chinese Kingpin Jinping, is smart. He's not as smart as President Putin, but he is a smart cookie. He's a smart fortune cookie, if you like. He's not stupid. At the moment, he's running rings around the West. I mean, like the West are half asleep. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't have the problem of having to win an election, because the Chinese Communist Party basically puts up their candidate, and that's the candidate who wins. Like the Democratic Party putting up a candidate in the United States in 2020. It didn't really matter who it was.
It's a selection, not an election.
Well, exactly. It wasn't a fair election. They could probably elect Nancy Pelosi elected in They could probably elected Nancy Pelosi in 2020, or Nancy Pelosi's dog. So the Chinese don't have to worry about their electorate. And the Chinese Kingpin, the Chinese dictator, is pretty smart and is running China in the Chinese well, what he thinks is the Chinese interest. He's certainly trying to run China in the Chinese interest.
Yes.
He's in fact headed towards a war, and he's going to get the crap beaten out of him because he's making the same mistake Adolf Hitler did in the 1930s. He thinks that because he's faced with a bunch of weak leaders like Neville Chamberlain and Edouard de Daladier, he thinks that, the West can only be run by clowns. Hitler starts a war and then suddenly finds a few months later the phony war's over and Britain has a serious prime minister, Winston Churchill. The leaderships can change very rapidly. The leadership in Britain is going to change fairly quickly, fairly soon, I think, because there are all sorts of problems with Rishi Sunak and the cabinet secretary. And those are understood in the intelligence community. And MPs are being briefed in. I just finished a briefing for one MP in the Tory party just before I came on air. We may well see a change, and change could come about very quickly in Britain. It won't come about quickly in the United States, but I can see President Trump getting back in November 24. I think rigging the next presidential election is going to be a lot more difficult because everybody's going to be on the alert for rigging and also familiar with the methods used in 2020, like tampering with voting machines remotely from Frankfurt and Maine. So the lines between Frankfurt and the United States are going to be under massive scrutiny by GCHQ, NSA, and so on, and the French in 2024. So my prediction is that President Trump will win the next election. And coming into 2025, because President Trump, if he wins, would then be sworn in, the legal cases against him are complete crocs. As a lawyer, I can tell you, they're all crocs. I mean, the one in New York is a farce because it's outside the statute of limitations.
Not to mention the president
in New York is a dead duck, and at some point, all these prosecutions are going to hit the Supreme Court, where you've got some serious lawyers on your Supreme Court. At some point, these prosecutions are going to run into major legal problems because a serious judge is going to look at them objectively and say this prosecution is crap, to use a technical legal expression.
But the precedent it sets, I mean, that's why Trump, when he was in office, he did not go after, say, the Clintons for what they're wrongdoing. He said, all right, this is not good for the country. We're not doing this.
Well, he didn't. He was right.
Precedent sets to go after a former president. The signal that sends to those who are opposing the country, right or wrong, like him or not, is just the wrong thing to do.
Yeah, you made a fair point, Gino. President Trump did not go after the Clintons in any meaningful way at all. In complete contrast to Biden, because Biden is behind all these prosecutions. The special prosecutor is no more than a lapdog of the White House. No offense intended. He bent us a 3-bob note as well. No offense intended. He's bringing prosecutions that he knows are complete crocs for political motive. It is naked. The motives are nakedly political in all of the prosecutions and indeed the civil cases against Donald Trump. Donald Trump, in respect of his predecessor, Bill Clinton, and also Obama, and in fairness, Joe Biden, he didn't go after Joe Biden or Hunter in relation to the Ukraine. And Burisma. I mean,
you're absolutely right. He most certainly could have done.
President Trump was much more statesmanlike than his critics would have you believe. You made a good point about where are the statesmen. I always enjoyed. I didn't have many dealings with him, but I had dealings with him. I always enjoyed dealing with Henry Kissinger. We had very strongly differing opinions. He's an Austrian, and I'm a Brit. He's got American nationality as well, but he's an Austrian man. He's an Austrian intelligence officer. But I liked Henry. I mean, we never actually met, but we have spoken on the phone, and I've dealt with his office, of course. And,
you don't have to like people to respect them, or to respect their intelligence.
I respect no matter. I don't care what anybody says about Henry Kissinger. He bombed Cambodia. He didn't bomb Cambodia. He had the Pentagon bomb Cambodia. He wasn't in a B-52 over Phnom Penh. I respect Henry Kissinger. I still do. The old boy is still going strong, even though he's 99. I wish I could deal with Henry Kissinger over the Ukraine. Henry is statesman that is sufficiently statesman-like to appreciate the realities. And when you're dealing with Henry Kissinger, you want to talk reality. You certainly do. I mean, I never tried to bullshit Henry Kissinger. I thought it's not my style anyway to bullshit people. And I certainly wouldn't have dreamt of bullshitting Henry Kissinger. He's a pretty smart cookie. It wouldn't work. Not my style. It wouldn't work anyway. But Henry likes dealing in facts. And Henry can recognize the facts, which are that neither Ukraine nor Russia can achieve a significant military breakthrough. And what we have is a World War I style stalemate, as you rightly described it. And if we continue in the West to sit on our bottoms and back the Ukraine willy-nilly with this absurd ambition to boot the Russians out of Crimea, which is now part of Russia, and the Donbass republics, which are also now part of, they're no longer the Donbass republics, they are now an integral part of the Russian Federation, inhabited, but for the most part, by ethnic Russians who are very welcoming of the protections provided by President Putin and Russia's very professional armed forces. Well, one or two queries over the logistics, but on the whole, Russia's armed forces are very professional. The idea that Ukraine's going to invade Crimea and take it over, that's as silly as Britain and France thinking they were going to take Crimea in 1854. The war is almost as silly as the Crimean War, where we ended up fighting alongside the French and the Turks against the Russians, which is complete utter nonsense. Should have been fighting with the Russians against the French and the Turks. So President Henry Kissinger would understand the realities. And if only the Ukrainians they could sign up Henry Kissinger to do the negotiating for him. If Henry and I were to sit down over a drink, we'd have the war settled in over a drink.
Well, at this point,
strategic realities. I mean, the lines of the basis of a settlement is clear. Russia hangs on to the parts of what used to be Ukraine that she has annexed. The Ukrainians give up their claims to those parts of Russia that they're trying to capture at the moment. There's an immediate...
That is the inevitable reality, whether you like it or not, but that is pretty much what's going to happen.
And Ukraine agrees not to join or apply to join either the European Union or NATO, because the minute they do that, they're going to trigger another war. I know the EU-NATO point is a sticking point with Zelensky, but of course, well, I suppose the reality is that there probably won't be peace unless and until the Russians catch up with Zelensky. He's got CIA advising him. He's, after all, a CIA asset. He's bankrolled by the CIA. Zelensky, if the Russians are able to take Zelensky out, which they've been trying for a long time to do it, if they were to take him out, that would make life a great deal easier. There are people in Kiev for the brain. I mean, I am in touch with people in Kiev. There are people in Kiev for the brain, and Zelensky has not got 100% support. There are people in Kiev, including in the military and the SBU. And the SBU are fairly, I mean, they're not good guys, but I've dealt with the SBU. It was, in fact, an SBU officer who told me about the abilities of the SA-2 and confirmed that Gary Powers couldn't possibly have been shot down by a missile because it couldn't possibly have reached that altitude, not with the version they had at the time. The modern days, the later versions, yes, but they didn't come around. They didn't come along for another 20 or 30 years, about 30 years, in fact, 78,000 feet. If any of your viewers think that Gary Powers was shot down, forget it. He wasn't shot down. He descended to 48,000 feet. And by agreement, the agreement having been set up by the man blamed for the shooting of President Kennedy.
I was just going to say, yeah, Lee Harvey Oswald.
Lee Harvey Oswald, yes. Lee Harvey Oswald took the date for the flight to the Russians. And the deal was that they would explode SA-2s at 45,000 feet, and that they advised by the CIA and the Americans that the tailplane of the U-2 was weak, which it was. Not because Kelly Johnson, who was a friend of a friend, didn't know how to design aircraft. He did. He was a brilliant designer.
Now, I will say, bring us back to Zelensky for a minute. I would say that.
Yeah, sorry, I diverted myself onto the U2.
We do a lot. We do that.
It's a fascinating topic.
I will say that, and this, looking at the situation as it is, looking at where the a large percent of the Ukrainian people and the foreign support are standing. If I was Zelensky, if I could find a way to resign and walk away and leave somebody else to deal with this.
I think Zelensky would be well advised to resign. Apart from anything else,
no, not that I don't have anything pro or con for Zelensky, and I will be upright and say, I said Ukraine deserves all the support we can send them to hold where they are. But if I was Zelensky, getting an exit stage would probably not be bad, because he is in a hell of a situation where he can't really do anything right that will not get him in trouble.
He's a man. I mean, he's shown considerable personal courage. He's certainly not truthful, and he's prepared to. At the moment, he's engaged in sacrificing the lives of tens of thousands of his countrymen on a frankly futile cause. And if Zelensky stays in power, the chances are the war is going to go on till 2025. I mean, the World War I comparison is getting more and more apposite by the day. We're
isn't this also?
It could last 4 years easily. I can see the war going till 2026.
Absolutely, unfortunately. And that actually comes to a question somebody asked, but I will say right now, the way it looks from having been there, it looks a little bit like this is turning into the test bed of new munitions, the Vietnam, if you will, where everybody's testing all their new stuff at the expense.
I mean, it's a war. It's a full scale war. So of course, the Pentagon HIMARS. I mean, HIMARS has hardly had a testing at all. I mean, it has been used in combat.
Certainly are now.
The Pentagon are loving it from that point of view. But then
everybody's making money on this.
Yes, wars are test beds for defense systems.
Yes.
You don't know how a system is going to work in practice until it's deployed. And by their very nature, defense systems can only be deployed in combat. So, yes, of course, the West are learning a great deal about the capabilities of some of our weapon system. And I have to say, systems like the HIMARS have come out of the war extremely well. I think the Russians have a new respect for Western military kit. Some of it has worked extremely well. Some of the Russian kit, particularly their tanks, haven't worked particularly well, although let me sound a note of caution for any pro-Ukrainian Zelensky supporting listeners, especially if you're from the CIA. The Russians have yet to deploy their latest tank, the Almaty, in any significant numbers. In fact, they've yet to manufacture significant numbers.
Is that the T90, the new T90?
Well, no, it's a development of the T90. It's usually referred to as the Almaty. I'm not sure of its T number. It's their new tank, the Almaty. It's got an automatic turret. There are no crew in the gun turret. It has excellent armor. And of course, the Ministry of Defense have now arranged to hand the Russians the details of our latest Dorchester armor. I suspect what's happened is the Russians have captured one or two British Challenger 2s with Dorchester armor, and the Russians have had a look at it and say, hey, the Brits understand armor. This is pretty good armor. They were the first with composite armor, with the Chobin armor, which we developed in the 70s. I think the Russian Ministry of Defense have had a look at our Dorchester armor and I said, we'll have some of that. And if I were a Russian tanker general, I'd say, look, I don't want to go into combat with the Almaty until we get the new British armor onto our tanks. So I suspect what's happened is that the Russians are busy designing an upgraded Almaty with our armor, which we have given to them thanks to the stupidity of the Ministry of Defense. I did warn them. I said, you deploy Challenger 2s on the battlefield, they're going to get the armor and they're going to put it on their latest tank. And the combination of their latest tank, which is a pretty nice bit of kit, and our new armor is going to, you're going to end up with a formidable tank, arguably the best main battle tank in the world, because the Challenger 2 is a little bit long on the tooth. It's actually very long on the tooth. It goes back to the 1990s.
Well,
I
I mean,
was
you
involved
would think
I
that
was
any
involved in upgrading the Challenger 2 in 1998, and certainly in proposals.
I mean, you think any of our enemies can pick up any number of our armaments in Afghanistan where we left it. I don't think the British, you didn't leave any challenge.
Well, we didn't deploy. A big mistake in Afghanistan. We pissed about in Afghanistan. It was a bit like you guys in Vietnam. We never really wanted to win, and we didn't deploy main battle tanks, which was a huge mistake. I remember visiting the Tank Museum down in Bovington, and the announcer was a commentator, was an ex-tanker man, and he said, well, we should have deployed one of these in Afghanistan. Just the very sound, the very presence of the main battle tank is enough to put the wind up most opposition.
And I will say that what I'm seeing on the Armada is, it looks like it's built as an evolution of the T-72 and the T-90.
Yes, Russian tank design has always been evolutionary, but that's
the T-55 and the T-72 have interchangeable parts. The T-90 have interchangeable parts. The only thing that changes the chassis, but the main flaw of all those tanks is still the magazine placement, and it looks like the Armada has some teething problems. But if the magazine is placed in the same way, it has exactly the same vulnerability. That once you penetrate into the main cabin, the whole thing cooks off. Because you hit the
that's where the Dorchester armor comes in. But in defense of the Russians, there are only so many places in a tank where you can put the magazine. The tank, in order to be effective, has to carry so many rounds of ammunition, and then your average tank is not that big. I mean, they're very impressive to look at, but your main battle tank is not going to be more than 20 feet long and more than 10 feet wide. There's not a lot of space to have a magazine. I think your comments about Russian magazine placement are fair, although I think a Russian tank designer on the program, he or she, they do have some nice lady tank designers, would say, but survival isn't the only issue. Accessibility is also very important. And where we place our magazines, the gunners can increase rate of fire. And then you then got arguments going all the way back to the Battle of Jutland about rate of fire versus magazine safety. The Royal Navy got the balance wrong with Jutland, and dangerous magazine handling practices resulted in a lot of battle cruisers, which wouldn't have been lost had the Royal Navy's magazine regulations been followed as they should have been. But the argument was it was an offensive. It was a bit like Britain. It was a bit like England's batting in the Lord's Test match. They got the balance between offense and defense wrong, and went on the attack and ended up losing. The Royal Navy laid too much of an emphasis, or certainly the captains of those particular battle cruisers laid too much of an emphasis on high rate of fire in order to increase the offensive capability of their ships, as opposed to their survivability. And that's the same argument that you've got with the tank. So there are the Russian placement of their magazines. There are arguments for it in terms of accessibility and rate of fire. But your point is a fair one. I think the Armada does need better armor, but of course we've just now given that to the Russians.
Let's see if it gets there. Here's